Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Ben White. I chair the Copyright Working Group. I can't get the slides to work. And this morning we've got an excellent discussion on the issue of COVID and copyright, as well as open licensing and the lessons that we've learned. I'm very happy indeed. The slides are rather slow in terms of their progression. Very happy indeed to welcome Stefan Kuster, Head of Institutional Relations at Frontiers, Sophie, Analyst and Managing Editor at Stockholm University Library, working, I think, not exclusively, but largely on ebooks. And last but not least, of course, she's also the chair of LIBA's Open Access Working Group. And finally, we have Robert Kiley, who's head of open research at Wellcome and also heavily involved in Plan S, around which we'll hear quite a lot later, I think. So the discussion is being recorded, so please keep that in mind. And the format is a sort of a loose discussion between not only the panelists, but also the attendees. So if you look in the top left-hand corner, you will see the attendee chat. So if there's anything that you hear while we're discussing that piques your interest, or there's any burning questions that you have, please put them in the attendee chat. And if we can, we will ask them. So there's no one that will have escaped the ramifications personally or professionally of COVID this year. And perhaps one of the areas that certainly in the UK where I'm based hasn't really been discussed in the public media is the effect that COVID has had on the ability of researchers and academics to access materials. And I guess the starting point for this discussion is copyright law, which is why I'm here, because open access is a form of licensing, and therefore the building blocks, as it were, of our discussion around the desirability or perhaps lack of desirability, although given the panelists, you can probably guess which side will fall on that one. You know, the fundamental is copyright, which then immediately leads into licensing. So starting with copyright, as librarians, everyone will have a basic understanding. In 1 minute lesson, it creates a monopoly right for the authors, for the creators, and that monopoly right is balanced during the period of copyright, which in Europe lasts a very long time, on average life plus 70 years, and then the material enters the public domain. And what we have during the period of copyright are what are called limitations and exceptions. These are exceptions to that monopoly right. And as many people will be aware, if not everybody, what we have are exceptions to facilitate research. So in the context of a library, for example, very common exceptions are preservation, the ability of a librarian to make a copy for a researcher or a student on their behalf and supply it to them, or kind of personal copying exceptions where you as an individual can make a copy of something that you have access to. So essentially, the law, I would argue, is still very analog based. And clearly in February, March, this caused a problem when universities rapidly had to go online. So, you know, one of my colleagues, one of the board members of LIBA, referred to it as libraries in lockdown. So the libraries themselves went into lockdown, and students and researchers like myself could not physically access the collection. So we had this rapid demand for electronic material. And I guess the theme of today is probably the budget ramifications of that and the access ramifications. So, you know, researchers were not able to physically visit the library. In fact, many of the libraries were shut, so the librarians couldn't actually access the physical collections either. So we had this situation where lecturers were at home, students were at home, librarians were at home, and all we could really access were our own physical collections at home or where we had electronic subscriptions. So in terms of, so I'll give one example. So a researcher has a book like this book, which I'll talk about yesterday, and he wants his students to read 3 chapters. Well, you know, copyright law in most European countries will not allow, in fact, probably all European countries will probably not allow somebody to photograph or scan in 3-4 chapters and send that to 30 or 60 students. Copyright law does not allow that. So there were many calls for a kind of in the spring, not just in Europe, but globally, for a sort of a rapid COVID-focused flexibilities to be introduced. So, for example, LIBA wrote to an open letter to all publishers, the European Commission and member state governments, asking for a time-limited introduction of either soft law or hard law amendments to allow for people to make copies and share copies for educational and research purposes. Unfortunately, in the LIBA example, we got no responses at all from any publisher. We did get a response from the European Commission, which pointed us in the direction of the Digital Single Market Directive, which was being implemented in all member states by, I think it is June 2021. So kind of, one of my colleagues said, crisis, what crisis? I wait a year and maybe the implementation of the Digital Single Market Directive will help with the crisis. Publishers, there was, I think, from journal publishers specifically, we've seen something like, we estimate 90 to 100,000 articles potentially being made open access. So Wiley, something like 11,000 articles, Springer 31,000, Elsevier 45,000 articles specifically on COVID. So we also saw in regard to ebooks, we saw the number of concurrent users of licenses being waived, which I think Sophie and I will go back to in a bit. So we saw a response, perhaps a scientific response to COVID. In LIBA Quarterly, we published an article which was, I think, May, which found that whereas there was a very good response and availability of articles around the coronavirus itself, it was less good in terms of availability and open access to articles which talked about the treatments. So, maybe that's improved, but selection issues again in regards to proprietary published articles. Collective management organizations, which offer kind of blanket licenses. In most European countries, in civil law countries, their role is defined in law. So in order to offer some kind of rapid response to COVID, let's call it, in terms of allowing people to copy more than just the standard 1 chapter and share, that in many EU countries would require change to the law. In the UK, which is more mandate-based, we saw in, let's say, May, June time, I might have that slightly wrong, the Copyright Licensing Agency, collective management organization offering licenses for text-based works, they came up with a license which allowed you to copy 2 chapters. At that time, there was actually nobody in the libraries, so that didn't really help the librarians, but potentially it would have helped the lecturers at home. But again, there in my case, researcher into law, if I look down that list, legal publishers, or some of the largest legal publishers and most important ones in the English language, were not on the list at all. So again, you have, perhaps characterizing it, a sort of a selective approach to the response to COVID. So in terms of libraries themselves and copyright, we saw in the States the Internet Archive launch what it called the Emergency Library. And the Internet Archive in Californian law is a library in terms of the law there. And what they were doing was they were scanning in paper books. They were not lending that paper book, and they were lending a digital copy of that book on a one book, one user basis, using a technical protection measure, which is also called digital rights management systems, slightly erroneously. But essentially, one book, one user, equivalent to, let's say, the lending of the paper book. No more than one person could access one book if the Internet Archive only had one book in their physical collection. And this has resulted in litigation. So ironically, probably, I would argue that that activity is legal under European Union law as a result of a 2016 case, which is the Dutch Public Library Association versus Stichting Lienrecht, where they ruled that libraries were able, without a license, to lend ebooks. So we've seen sort of different. We've seen perhaps no response to calls for flexibility that we see from organisations like LIBA, from governments. We've seen, I think, in perhaps to be debated, but a science-focused response, specifically on corona from publishers. We've seen, I think, to my knowledge, a very limited response from the organizations that offer blanket licenses for copying. And in the States, we didn't see in Europe an Internet Archive set up, although, as I said, it probably is legal in the EU. And then in America, we see threatened litigation. So overall, I think probably, I don't know, opening this up to my colleagues, as we know, copyright law is very slow to evolve. The Copyright Directive was first passed in 2001. We've seen a substantive update in 2019, 18 years later. So copyright does not evolve quickly, I think it would be fair to say. And even interestingly, going into exceptions, the UK, for example, has an exception which is not used about, not really written about, which allows, if there are other bodies of law which allow access to copyright works, that will trump copyright law. So essentially, we could in the UK have perhaps argued that human rights legislation guarantees a right to education, and therefore we could assert this exception when the libraries are shut to allow copying. Research Libraries UK wrote to the UK government, and again sort of got a very terse response, which again did not signal that from the copyright angle that there was going to be any help coming from the legislature. So I guess in summary, I would say, and you know, Robert, Sophie, Stefan, if you've got any other views, copyright is perhaps not very flexible in a time of crisis. Is there any disagreement? No,
Not
is there
really. But you could also say something about that I was thinking about when we prepared for this webinar, was also that in a time of crisis, you might want to look inwards, but also outwards, because copyright law is by default something that goes on in each and every nation. So there's no joint copyright law. So each country have their own laws, which is a problem when you want information to be flowing through. That's also one of the attempts of the Creative Commons licensing, the open licensing, is to create some kind of common agreement on what we mean by sharing, what we mean by downloading, what we mean by being able to reuse material that's been published under this license. And I think that's where the copyright laws of each country and the directives of the EU is far behind, because it doesn't even seem to be adjusting to the electronic world, which we've had for 20 years. And that's a pity, because I think what we as humans want to be able to do is not backed up by the law that can protect us and guide us.
I guess that, again, sorry, Robert, yeah.
I was gonna just gonna add. I mean, I think, in a pure world, if we were keeping things simple, having legislation which said that but research which is funded by the public purse must be open, that would solve all our problems overnight. But that's probably not going to happen in our lifetimes. There is a slide which I'll share later, which colleague Jerome in Netherlands has created, where he's been through all the different countries and articulated what legislation they've implemented to support the sharing of government funded research articles. And as half a dozen countries have got some legislation, but all of them have limitations on the sharing of that, and typically they impose embargoes, a minimum of 6 months, and I think in Italy they impose embargoes of 24 months for humanities funded research. So the idea that in a time of a global pandemic we can just sort of put our slippers on and get our cigars out and say we'll look at that in 2 years' time is just not credible. And that's why, when I come to, maybe in a minute, that's why in Coalition S we decided we needed a different approach. Rather than wait for governments to change copyright law, was to develop a rights retention strategy from the funder side.
Okay, Stefan.
Yeah, I would add that indeed, of course, I agree that changing copyright would take a long time and will take a long time, and it is probably needed, but we don't need to wait for that to happen, because technology allows for alternative models, and there are alternative models available. And one of those models is open access. That is what Coalition S and Plan S aims to incentivize towards using that model. And from the perspective of a publisher that uses that model, I would say that the technology is there, and the rules do not prevent you from doing it. It's actually a choice whether you use digital technology to impose paywalls and block content, or whether you actually use it to open to that content. And we, as a publisher, use open licenses, and that's entirely compatible with copyright. Of course, that doesn't solve the huge problem of all the body of knowledge that is behind a paywall and is copyrighted, and for that we do need the reform. But going forward, we do have the models, technology-wise and also incentive-wise, and that's, I think, why things like Plan S and policies are so important.
Thank you. So perhaps moving away from copyright now and to the issue of e-books, which, if you look on the Liber website, there's very in-depth and interesting interview with a UK librarian, and which outlines many of the issues that she's had with ebooks, which I would recommend. I don't know if Tanya can put that link in the chat if people are interested. So I think ebooks have been a very sore subject, I think, for librarians, from different angles perhaps. So if my book, again, making a comeback, the libraries were shut, and I was desperate to see this book to evaluate whether it was helpful for my research or not. My library could buy the paper version. University Library could buy the paper version, but the publisher, Oxford University Press, would not give access to the library in E. So it was left to me to make the choice whether I wanted to buy this book, which something like 130 euros. In the end, I found a cheap secondhand one after months and after something like 6 months of looking. So we have kind of various issues, I think, around access and also budget. I think Sconnell estimates that only 10% of all monographs are available in E. And I know, Sophie, in our presentation, one of the largest publishers in Sweden doesn't have any ebooks. As an ebook publisher, I'd just like to get your kind of thoughts about what you've seen and where you think we should go.
Well, Tanya, if you could, I've brought some examples just to show. So the two things, as I see it, the first is the access itself. So if there is an electronic version, can you access it? That's what you have to check as a librarian. The other one is availability. Is there even a copy available for you to license to your users? But these problems can go together or be separate sometimes, but sometimes they are together. But just to show you a little bit of a quick overview, I think many of the things that has been made open access, because the publishers have responded quite quickly to the coronavirus need of more information. They have released access to lots of collections. They have made beautiful websites where it's easy to find what they have on this topic. They are helping users to direct them to the content. This is an example from Cambridge, where they have, for example, 1,255 articles, but you see that only 852 of them are open access. So they have free access to articles, but not everything is open access. And that is a problem, because then you can share some of this among colleagues and maybe even reuse it in your own research, but a large part of that information is only temporary, which is a problem from a librarian's perspective. So how can we then recommend our users to use this material if we are not sure if they can use it in a week or not, or in a month? The same goes with other publishers. They have, beautiful websites. They have even been able to fast track things so that the publication process is faster. So they have several preprints options. They give support to authors so that they can collect their articles faster. This is all excellent things. And then they also provide access, but from their own website, where you have to register to get to their content so that they can collect information about you and can contact you later. That may or may not be a good thing. But from a library perspective, we want to give our users access to as much as possible, anything, and not only just articles about COVID. It could also be articles about how humans react to a pandemic, which we also have to figure out in this time. It could be how is the cultural sector influenced by the pandemic when we can no longer watch concerts, for example. So from a library perspective, you want to collect everything and tell your users how to access this. And this is an example from not my own university, but another Swedish university, where they collected a nice little page. They try to explain to their users how they can access content. And this lists a few of the problems. So access and scope vary depending on the publisher, which from a user perspective is problematic. They're not usually caring that much about which publisher it is. It is an article or a book that they want. Access is given for a limited time, not saying exactly how long. And the library provides this information, but cannot control the extent of available content, which is also a problem. So we can say that, well, for now, you can read this. And the last one is the content of this page is divided, and then try to organize it. So they have organized it in free access to parts or entire content, free access to COVID-related information, and free access to remote learning resources. Because it's not only researchers who need access, we also need content for teaching, supporting teachers. Here's another example from JSTOR, one of the world's biggest providers of electronic access. And their ebook access related to COVID-19 has expired. I would say that we still need this access. I'm not sure what they are doing right now, but this is from today, but it was last updated in August. But they also trying to explain to their users how to access information. So bringing it back to, yes, so let's say that we then wanted to buy access. There's also a budget thing. So if we want to buy an ebook, if there is an ebook available and we want to buy it, then we have to figure out how can that be accessible to as many users as possible. So licensing for ebooks providers shift and change and are not consistent along the line for all ebooks from one publisher. And this is a voice from a colleague from Ireland, where they have a set budget. The budget has been adjusted upwards so that we can buy electronic material, but publishers are then in turn slow to respond to the situation. Terms are dictated, some of the terms are unreasonable. You have a single user license, for example, for a whole class of students. And then also the problem that Joanna pointed out in her blog post that I also linked to in the chat is that all of this free access is great, but it doesn't really fulfill the entire need for information, especially not for teaching. So, and also when they provide access, it's expensive, not licensed properly, and it's hard for them to get access to that. So there's so many problems listed here that I can't even get into them all. But we should consider that it's not only COVID-related directly research, but also information in general. And the copyright laws here are, again, proving not to support us. And the publishers are trying to support us, but not reaching all the way through. I don't know how to deal with this, really, because there is no answers, just a lot of questions and problems, isn't it?
So on you mentioned budget there, Sophie. So
yeah.
I've been doing some work looking at paper title, and it's not uncommon to see an ebook for a single user being 8, 9, 10 times the price of the ebook. In the article that you linked to there, I think Johanna refers to one book which is 900 euros for single book, and for single user access, and there are 60 students that need access to that. We know we have a monograph crisis already.
Yes.
The majority of the budgets from university libraries, which are being cut, the universities UK in the UK obviously have asked for a 25% reduction in the subscriptions. So we have small budgets. They've been eaten up. We have cuts. We have very expensive ebooks, and we see librarians cutting reading lists in response, or looking for open access material.
Yes.
I'm just interested in your view on budgets and kind of where we go from here.
Well, my view on budgets, well, I don't know if I'm entitled to say something about that, but I would say that, let's say that we try to make a shift and publish more open access books, which is something that we try to do at Stockholm University Press, even though we're a very small press, but there are other examples as well. The UK's biggest open access book publisher is probably UCL Press, and they're doing a great job. But the challenge there, if we want to make the books open access in the future, to get away from this licensing problem, is funding. Because there's not enough funding to produce these books, because of course it's still a price tag to make a nice looking book, even if it's an electronic version. And that should be said, there are usually no free lunches. So I'd like to play in Robert here, because, for example, Plan S has said that they are planning for a structure for ebooks in the future, or open access books. what can we do here? Can we do anything more from a funding perspective to show people that it's possible to produce more open access books or ebooks for that matter?
I'm going to duck that to an extent, Sophie. We're fighting on the journal article front at the moment. I can speak from Wellcome's perspective. Wellcome does have a policy relating to monographs and book chapters which arise from its funding. And just as we pay for journal articles to be made open access, we pay for book chapters and indeed whole books. So I wouldn't say routinely, but on a fairly frequent basis, we may be asked to give 10 or 15,000 euros to support a Palgrave publication or whatever. So we strongly believe that research output should be open, whether they're monograph form or article form. I think Plan S at the moment, I say, is pretty much focused on journal articles, but we will come back to books. But they are much more challenging. In some ways, journal articles should be the low-hanging fruit, but given the work and effort and relative lack of progress we've made over the last 15 years, that low-hanging fruit is still proving out of reach for many of us.
Yes, indeed. And of course, we appreciate that effort. Of course, it's just that I've seen also that a lot of individual funders are giving support for open access books. It's just a very slow uptake, and I guess it's a different cultural strain that you have to tap into. It's different. How you publish a book looks different from publishing a journal article, for example. Also, that there's lots of smaller actors on the field that might not have the muscles to negotiate big deals, for example.
Just again, going back to we've got these two issues here. We've got budget. Budgets are shrinking very, very rapidly. We have a monograph crisis already. We have a lack of availability. Again, Sconnell estimated that only 10% of books are available in e-form. It doesn't feel, unless there is from the open access perspective now a real focus on the importance of open books, it really feels the challenges of publishing books and getting access to them is going to become very, very serious over the next 5 years, because I think it's going to take many years for our economies to recover from this.
I agree. Yeah. And also that we should say also, just to make things clear, that there's a difference between textbooks and research books. So let's say that you had the problems with access to teaching material is about textbooks, and what research funders, for example, are usually trying to support is books that includes research that they have, given support for. So there's so many angles you could talk about this, so that's why I get confused. But also I see progress, but it's very slow indeed.
So I guess any kind of focus on the issue of ebooks and monographs would be welcome at the governmental level, the trade association level, potentially, the university level. Otherwise,
I guess we need to work on a national level there first, because also what we see among books is that they're to a greater extent also published in other languages than English, especially for teaching.
I mean, is there something that an organisation like LIBO should raise to the Commission, to member state governments? As head of the LIBO Open Access Working Group.
Yes, because for us, it's we have lots of experts on how to create journal deals, but we need more expertise in libraries on how to work with access to ebooks and how they are used for teaching in a remote teaching, for example. So I think we as an organization could support librarians to get more dig more deeper into this, and then also work on a policy, influencing policy level, which is also one of our tasks as an organization. So working from both sides, so to speak, both on a local level for building knowledge and skills, and then also at a policy level to make sure that there is, for example, might be more opportunities for funding in the future.
Interesting question here from Inga on learning on ebooks. Should we invest in open learning material platforms rather than books? There's no point in having a platform without a book. so it's not necessarily an either or.
No, and the platform, I mean, there are several open book platforms. One is OAPEN Library, which includes, I don't know how many thousands of open books on different topics, different languages, where you can harvest metadata to include in your own catalog at home. So there are several services. I just think we need to grow more accustomed to using them. And then that will help grow this community of people knowing where to find content that's open and seeing that it's really great content that's open. But a platform, it's good if it's not, can also serve a purpose. Yes.
So just moving now to the other side of open, not just ebooks, but open access articles. I'm aware that, Robert, you've written a couple of articles on COVID and open access journals. I'd be interested in your kind of views. What is it that we've seen that COVID has brought into focus for funders, for researchers, for governments?
Thanks, Ben. So I think it's obvious in some ways that what it's shown more than anything is everyone agrees that we need access to the information, and that's why we have seen publishers, falling over themselves to. So we published a letter, Welcome published a letter, I don't know, February or March time, when we called on the publishing community to make all the coronavirus and related articles at open access, and pretty much to publishers up and throughout the world pretty much responded to that, and that's why we see those significant numbers you read out earlier, like almost 50,000 Elsevier articles, something like 40,000 Springer Nature articles, and so forth. So the publishers have clearly responded, but obviously the inevitable argument, if everyone recognizes the value of openness for COVID, well, why not climate change, or why not food security, or why not enter your favorite disease topic or whatever of interest? So I think that's clearly what needs to happen. If you can indulge me, I'm very conscious of time, and we want to get to questions, but if you can indulge me just to go through a couple of slides and just show what we're trying to do within Welcome and within Coalition S to try and move this agenda forward. So we all know that there's a lot of access content which is not open. This slide from a few years ago shows about 75% of content on publication is not open. And even if it was open for readable, it may not be open for reuse. And obviously, with so much content being published, we want it to be open. And again, with the coronavirus example, we have seen huge developments in sort of AI and text and data mining, where technology providers have started to develop new tools to help read this huge corpus of content to help uncover new knowledge. So that's the issues we're trying to solve. And we touched earlier about, well, can't we just change copyright law? And I hope these slides will be shared after, because you won't be able to read that. But as I said, a number of countries have made some changes to copyright law, which is great. But as I say, it typically imposes an embargo of between 6 and 24 months. The Netherlands have got a really interesting case where they don't actually define a period. They just say reasonable. And we all know what reasonable means is what's reasonable to me may be unreasonable to someone else. They've defined at the moment as 6 months. Be interesting to see whether they decide that actually 3 months was actually what they meant by reasonable, or whatever. So copyright law would help, but as we said, it's going to be a a bit of a long haul, and in a time of a global pandemic, really we don't have that time. And so what Coalition S has done is develop this thing called the rights retention strategy. And so we know we want the work we fund to be made open access, and typically the most obvious way we do that is we impose it as a grant condition. You take the welcome shilling, you make the work open access. Job done. Well, yes, to an extent, but what happens, of course, is that publishers and researchers sign agreements with publishers which contradicts that agreement. So the researcher has signed an agreement with Wellcome that says, yeah, I make the work open access, and then they sign an agreement downstream with publisher X, which says, yes, I'll accept the fact my work is paywalled and embargoed for X months. So there's an inherent contradiction. And what the rights retention strategy does is just resolve that contradiction for once and for all. What we're doing is basically three activities. One, changing our grant conditions to make it clear that works have to be made open access, and crucially, what we're doing is we're adding a condition to the grant conditions such that when an article is submitted, it's made clear that should that submission evolve into an accepted manuscript, that accepted manuscript comes pre-licensed with a CC BY license. So we're updating our grant conditions. We're notifying publishers that this happens, and then we require our beneficiaries, our grant holders, to add a piece of language to their submissions to reiterate to publishers that if you consider this manuscript and downstream you decide to publish it, as an absolute minimum, I'll be able to post the author accepted manuscript. And what that looks like in practice is something like this. So we say in our grant condition, you've got to make everything open access from PubMed Central, you're at PubMed Central. Define that to be peer-reviewed journals and so forth. And then the grant conditions say you hereby grant a CC BY license to all future author-accepted manuscripts. And then we add this requirement on the researcher to insert this magic language into their submissions. So for donkey's years, we've said you have to attribute us. So this research was funded by X Wellcome Trusts and grant number. And then we've added these 25 other words. They are like magic words. But it simply says, for the purpose of open access, the author has applied a CC BY license to any author manuscript version arising from that submission. And you might think, well, how does that work? Is it that simple? Yes, it is that simple. Because the way copyright works is that an assignee or an exclusive licensee of that copyright, i.e. the publisher, takes that assignment or exclusive license subject to any prior granting of rights to that copyright works to which they had notice. So as that CC BY license to the future author accepted manuscript was already in place prior to any publication agreement. Remember, this agreement is signed on the day they get the grant or the day we update the grant conditions, long before they get the test tubes out and they start putting pen to paper, as it were. That license is in place. And as long as the publisher is aware of that, that prior license trumps any conflicting language in the publication agreement. So we always have the right now, our researchers, Wellcome and Coalition S broadly, will have the right to always, as a minimum, make the author manuscript open access. We don't really want to do that. We want to make the version of record open access, and we will happily pay for that to happen. So where a publisher like Frontiers has makes the version of record open access, we will never ever expose the author accepted manuscript, because why would we when there's a version of record available? But if a publisher hasn't developed a way in which the version of record can be made open access in line with Plan S, well, we're going to do it anyway. So we've effectively moved the goalpost. We're saying we are deciding how the research which we have funded, which is a really expensive part of doing research, we're saying how that research should be shared. And if a publisher wishes to consider that manuscript, then it does so in the knowledge that the author has the right to make that work open access. I'll stop there.
So I guess the same question to you, Stefan, as a open access publisher, what challenges, opportunities? What have you seen coming from COVID?
Right. So, well, as an open access publisher, and I think this is true for the majority of open access publishers, if not all of them, we never ask for a transfer of copyright from the author to us. Copyright always remains with the author. What we do ask is that once the article has gone through peer review and the recommendation is to publish, is that the author allows us to publish the article with the CC BY license. So entirely compliant with Plan S, and no need for embargoes. All the content is immediately open and accessible everywhere, and this includes accessible for human reading and for machine reading, which I think is one of the is an important point. This also means that the article, the content can be downloaded into a repository. So if that is an additional requirement by a policy, or even if it's just a personal wish of the authors, the content can be downloaded into a repository of choice. And I mean, this should be a no-brainer, but it's worth pointing out that it also means that the author can share their own work as they see fit, put it on their own website or send it to colleagues. All of this are the advantages of open access. And I think you all know this. I think, and as I said in the beginning, this is a choice, however, as a publisher to do it this way. It's a choice that is available because the technology allows it, and it's a choice that is not limited by the current copyright rules and laws. So it's I guess it's an argument of fairness. It's an argument of it's a moral choice, and I don't want to preach from a high moral horse. Everyone knows that Frontiers is a commercial publisher, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think one of the things that commercial publishers have demonstrated is that you can do this and also be commercially viable and at a fair price that matches the service you are providing. I think related to that is one of the challenges that have become very clear. It would be naive to say that we didn't know this before, but that have been shown to us again through the COVID crisis, is that open access in itself is not, so providing the access to read is not the only issue. It is also about that access being equitable and inclusive. Some of the hardest hit communities, the hardest hit by COVID, are communities that are prevented for economic reasons or technical reasons from accessing knowledge. So I think this is something that the entire open access community, and actually the entire scholarly communications community, has to work on in improving the equity and inclusivity of the system. We conducted a survey of our editorial board and received, I think, roughly 25,000 responses of active researchers of what were their concerns and what is life like as a researcher under COVID. And the number one concern was the availability of funding, of research funding, but also of funding within their institutions and budgets to operate, but that includes to access literature. So this is something we have to be keenly aware of. I think on a very practical aspect, I want to mention is that one of the advantages of using public licenses like CC BY is that we don't need large teams of lawyers to enforce copyright, to go after authors that infringe copyright, or to go after Sci-Hub. So that makes our life much easier on that side of things, and that's also something that's one cost that we don't have to ask our customers or include in our APC. So that's a very practical aspect.
So going back to the core from a librarian's perspective, which is budget, we are already seeing large library budget cuts in terms of their acquisitions. Is open access publishing cheaper than proprietary publishing? How do we get the costs if it's not just an access issue, it's also a cost issue? If we are seeing large library cuts, that means existing prices that researchers and students have less access to content. I'm interested in all your thoughts around how we make things cheaper, I guess, to help library budget cuts.
Can I go first? I mean, I think one of the things, nothing to with Plan S as such, but the OA 2020 movement has been really key to this. Is arguing that there's plenty of money in the system. Even the publishers are not arguing there's not enough money in the system. There's this $10-12 billion a year being spent on this activity. The overwhelming majority of that's coming from library budgets across the globe. And we need to find a way to, if our researchers want to continue to publish with subscription publishers, we just need to find a way to migrate those funds to pay not for hiding content away, but for actually, so rather than paying to read, you pay to publish. And I think, credit to the Max Planck Society for all the work they've done in really pushing that. And we're now seeing, predominantly in Europe, but we are starting to see in other parts of the world, particularly in the US more recently, that libraries are sort of using their collective muscle to say, we're happy to give you these millions of euros or millions of dollars every year, but we want not only to be able to read what we subscribe to, but when we publish, we want that to be open access. So I think that is the trick here. Of course, open access publishing can be cheaper. I'm sure it can also be more expensive if you like, but there are certain, it can be cheaper, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and sorry, and I would say, of course, we have to look into the budget and make sure that we don't spend money unwisely or not wisely, because as a university funded by public money, for example, we have to look into exactly where we put our money, so the money that we have to spend, so to speak, regardless whether or not it's a limited budget or not. And I would say that we need to change again here. For me, it's a cultural change to talk about what things costs and to add a level of transparency here so that we can understand what we pay for. And I think Frontiers has also been involved in structures to try to make this more transparent. This is what you pay for. This is what we think is a fair price. Of course, there's always going to be differences in costs depending on what you get. So I wouldn't say that open access should be cheaper. I don't necessarily want it to be cheaper either, because we still want good service. But we should know what we pay for so that we can make an informed decision. And that for me is the most important discussion. I don't know what you think, Stefan.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, I don't want to preach from a high moral horse, but I think one of the very practical advantages that an open access publisher has that uses a single fee, and maybe the name article processing charge needs to change, because we do a lot more, open access publishers do a lot more than process an article. I mean, there's the perpetual, making it available perpetually and so on. But the advantage of having a single fee is that it allows that transparency. We don't charge for any image treatments and any other fee than the APC, which is always publicly stated. And as you said, most open access publishers participate in the transparency frameworks that have also been incentivized or supported by Coalition S. So that provides an additional layer of transparency. But again, it's a matter of choice. You can choose not to participate and not be transparent and be opaque, even if you have an open model, and you can choose to be transparent if you're a mixed model or a publisher that uses a different model. There are practical complications, granted, and even for us, it's not easy to comply with all the requirements. I mean, there is work involved in making things transparent at a journal level, but that's work that is worth doing, because it's in our interest as a publisher to show the real cost of publishing and linking the costs and the price to the services, and then letting the market, basically you guys and the authors, choose what level of service fits their needs.
I
I guess
completely agree with that. Just say there was a lot of discussion yesterday, for example, when Springer Nature announced that the notional publishing fee for Nature would be €9,500, and there was a lot of uproar in the community, like this is scandalously expensive and so on. But until you know what services are being provided, it's actually, though instinctively you might think, Jesus, that's a lot of money. Until you actually know what services are provided, it's very difficult to actually make a judgment. So Stefan's already alluded to this, but within Plan S and Coalition S, we do have these frameworks, and we've said that any publisher, whether it's Frontiers or F1000 or anyone, if they want to continue to enjoy revenue from Coalition S funders, no later than July 2022, all publishers will have to be transparent about the services they provide and the prices they charge for those services.
I guess just making a very basic point, if let's say a library's budget, so let's take the UK figure, 25% reduction in subscriptions, if your library has 25% money next year compared to this year, that with the annual inflations, the business as normal 5 to 10% addition, that's essentially 27-28% less content that the library can purchase. So
or 25% less, or 25% less funding for paying for open access as well, because it comes from the same budget, I would say.
Yeah.
So yeah. I mean, we really need to think this through, what we spend our money on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not forget about the books.
Don't forget about the books. Absolutely. Nice question, I think, aimed at Robert, which is the question that I was thinking, copyright question. What happens when the manuscript submission system that requires authors to tick a box stating this article is not subject to any prior rights or licenses?
Okay, so
a conflict of terms there.
There's I suppose there's two options there. If the publisher wants to receive, let's just use Welcome as an example. So Welcome submissions will come with these magic words from January. If a publisher wants to consider any manuscript, it's going to have to update that submission systems to not ask that binary question. I'm assuming that if you didn't tick it, you can't proceed. Well, they won't get any submissions. That's one option. Yeah. The other option, of course, is you tick the box, but it doesn't really matter what you tick the box, because the submission itself contains the magic words. So the submission makes it clear that this article comes pre-licensed. I really hope we're not going to get into a world of playing silly games like, oh, we've ticked this box, therefore this trumps that. We've been absolutely clear that we want the version of record and we'll pay the version of record, and we'll only make use of this author manuscript when that is not available. And if games are played where researchers tick boxes and things, and that stops them doing things, well, we will not find that acceptable.
So will Welcome or Plan S be setting up a sort of researcher support office or staff that will be able to work with researchers and publishers, where I think probably inevitably there might be some problems or questions? I've gone on.
Not at the Coalition S level. Individual funders will decide how best to support their own researchers. Right. So what we're talking about realistically is an article is made open access and in a repository, and the publisher issues a takedown notice. What happens next is like the question. And what we would do, and obviously we have a specific repository, we have research made available in PubMed Central and Europe PubMed Central. We would urge the EBI and NCBI who run those to reach out to us, and we would do a couple of very simple checks. We would see, with this article, have we ever communicated with this publisher? And if it's a publisher we've never spoken to, we would go back to the institution and say, go back to EBI in this case and say, they didn't know about this. I think it's a perfectly legitimate claim that we take this down. But if it is a publisher we spent the last 3 months discussing with, for them to argue they didn't know about this prior right seems a little bit disingenuous. And in that circumstance, we would advise EBI and NCBI in this example not to take that manuscript down.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Well, we've hit the hour. Lots of interesting discussions. I'd like to say very much thank you to Robert, Stefan, and Sophie for their views. If you want to listen to this again, it will go on the LIBA YouTube channel. And if you've got any kind of questions or lingering questions, I suppose, if you could email them to LIBA and we'll forward them on. So thank you very much. This is the point where you all put claps, which I can never work out how you do it. But anyway, Tanya, if you could, there we go. Lots of nice claps for our excellent speakers. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.